And please feel free to orbit around and get your coffee, get your sweets, get your stuff, and then come back and sit down wherever you like. I'm not going to be offended by any kind of milling. That's fine. But I do want to just go ahead and get going, so as not so that I can get through what I need to get through. Mother Liz is not here, so I think I'm introducing myself. So hi. Hi. So just by way of introduction, my name is Slade, and I work at a lot of jobs at once, which is kind of a wonderful jumble. So I'm technically a full-time employee of Trinity Church Princeton, but about half of my time is spent with the Episcopal chaplaincy to Princeton University and Princeton Seminary, and I work especially with seminary students, so I teach, and I also teach Anglican studies at Princeton Seminary. So those are some things that I do. Over down the road, I came to Princeton about a year ago, right as I was finishing my dissertation. I do not function well in the real world, apparently, and so thus I've ended up doing 2 doctorates. I did one in mechanical engineering and material science way back when, in 2000. After that, I worked for the federal government for about 5 years in research and development. A lot of really complicated things happened in my life that ended me up in seminary after that. And then I ended up staying on to do a PhD in theology, and really my research area, my interest is in kind of the interactions between theology and science, and the various ways that happens, either for good or for ill, particularly on the kind of the moral scale, not so much on the knowledge scale. Those are 2 kind of different things. So before coming to Trinity, while I was in graduate school, I served some rural churches in North Carolina, so in Laurinburg, North Carolina, and Oxford, North Carolina. So I went from small to very big. So that's been a fun change for me. And this is my first time living in the North. I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, which is culturally Alabama, and then spent most of my adult life in North Carolina and Virginia. So I was terrified to move to New Jersey, because I thought that all of New Jersey was like the Newark airport. Right, where you go past the Newark airport, and there's like flames shooting into the air, and it's like this apocalyptic landscape. Oh my gosh, what am I about to do? But actually, it's very beautiful, and I love living up here. I'm a converted resident of New Jersey, kind of a zealous convert. I love pork roll. I cannot abide scrapple, though. That is a bridge too far. So that's me. And what I want to do today is to really talk about what it means to say in John's Gospel that through the Word all things were made, and how this has to do with the way that we think about our time, about creation, and about redemption. And some of this is a little bit of a freestyle lecture, and then part of it is a little more manuscripty. So hopefully that transition will work with a minimum of trauma for you, and then I'll just take some questions, and we can talk about whatever you have questions for. But I do have to get out of here pretty expeditiously so that I can get back and talk about baptism and confirmation for our young people. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to to read, so there are two Gospels that we kind of associate with Christmas. And so now we're in the season of Epiphany. We talk about, the light that's enlightened the Gentiles. And it wasn't too long ago. Still, it seems like a long time ago. But yesterday, we just, if you put your Christmas decorations away at Candlemas, that was just yesterday. Some people put it away at Epiphany, but you can technically keep the tree up until February 2nd. So we're still just past the season of Christmastide. And we're still in the season of Epiphany. And so I want to revisit with you all the Gospels that we hear on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, because they kind of fit together in a way that helps us think about creation and redemption. The first, and as I'm going to read these, I want you to really listen to them, and listen to them so that kind of think about what details come to you as if for the first time, as you're sitting here today in the kind of the aftermath of Christmas. So this is Luke's Gospel. This is the one that we hear usually on Christmas Eve. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them at the inn. In that region there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." Suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace among those whom he favors." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds had told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen as it had been told them. And then on Christmas Day, we hear this from the Gospel according to John. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Okay, so now I want you to keep those two scripture passages in your mind as we go forward. And note that in the John passage starts with the same few words that begins the first chapter of Genesis, and this is not an accident. In the beginning was the Word. And it calls to mind the question of where we find our beginnings. Where does our story start? And what is the story that tells us who we are? This is the science part of the lecture. What is the story that tells us who we are? How many of y'all have seen the ads on TV for Ancestry.com, genetics, or 23andMe? Some folks have maybe done this. I won't ask you to out yourself if you've done it. And if you've done it, that's cool, but I'm going to ask some questions about it. But there's one ad in particular that I think is just really, really interesting from the Ancestry.com genetics thing. And it's this dude. And this dude, he goes along and he says, well, you know, all the time growing up, my family told me that we were German. And this is like an American guy, right? Kind of standard issue Midwestern. So my family told me that we were German. And, you know, I had lederhosen, and I liked the, you know, did all this sort of German-American cultural things, right? He says, but then I did Ancestry.com genetic testing, and I found out that I'm really Scottish, and so I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt. I mean, wow, genetics becomes culture, right? Genetics, science becomes this thing that, oh, this is the story that tells you who you are. You know, forget the other story that you grew up with. Here's your true story. And that can be true, not just in the kind of the cheesy example of, and the science is really kind of questionable about how they determine national traits and genetics. It's complicated. But beyond that, you know, what are the other stories that can come from a kind of genetic determinism? A story that says, well, you know, I'm susceptible to certain diseases, and that determines my future. Right? This is going to be my story. You know, or the ways that genetics gets used, that gets intertwined with race. It says again, this is the story, and this says things about your potential, and these things are alive, that this is how genetics has been used in the past to sort people into boxes, say, this is going to be your story, this is going to be your story. And that's the whole, the story of the eugenics movement in America, is all wrapped up in determining what people's stories are going to be. Well, what would it mean if we located our story somewhere else? What would it mean if we said that the story that matters for who I am and who I will become, the story that says, this is me, this is my identity, was found not in a kind of genetic determinism, but in the story of creation and redemption, the story that's told in Luke's gospel and John's gospel, and that points toward the cross. That isn't to say that genetics is meaningless. It isn't. That isn't to say that that these things aren't true. But it is to say, when I teach this to seminarians, and I go back and use So my background is in mechanical engineering, right? And so Ohm's law that says voltage is current times resistance, right? Everybody knows this. V equals IR. It's a rule of electric circuits, right? That V equals IR is true, but it doesn't have any hold on our moral imagination, right? It's just, okay, this is a science thing, it's true. But somehow genetics has become this thing that has a tremendous hold on our moral imagination that tells us this is our determining story. I always tell my students, well, genetics should have about as much hold on your moral imagination as Ohm's law. Okay, this is true. But that's not the story that tells me who I am. The story that tells me who I am comes from another place entirely. I want to start with two anecdotes, and then I kind of go into the part that's a paper that I gave. So the first anecdote is something that one of my former professors, again, the one that I quoted in my sermon, that wrote love on the board and says, we don't know what this means. The same professor, this is a story that she tells about her daughter, Emily. Emily was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 at the time that this story happened. And so they were getting ready for Christmas. And they were reading, sort of like getting ready for Jesus to come, and they were reading a story. And Emily says, so Jesus comes in a few days as a baby. Yeah. But then he dies. Yes, dear. He dies. And then he comes back. Yes, dear. As a grown-up. Yes, dear. But then he's coming as a baby. And she said, Mommy, I cannot think all these things at the same time. I said, yes, exactly. We cannot think all of these things at the same time. But one of the things about Christmas Eve and Christmas Day that make it kind of theologically special is that it's the closest that we come to actually trying to think those things at the same time within the liturgy. I mean, think about what happens at your Christmas Eve service, right? You read the birth narrative, and then you celebrate the Eucharist. And you say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. At this very moment, you have this whole collision of this, and this all together. I mean, it's really spectacular at Trinity Church because we have a special altar that we use during Christmas time, and the altar actually is over, the crutch goes under the altar. So the altar actually creates the stable. And so the birth and the death are all together at once. And we're trying to think all of those things at the same time. But the point of the liturgical calendar, the reason that we have this cycle is so that we can try to think all of these things at the same time. The second is just an explanatory anecdote before I get to I'm going to say something else in a moment. But you all up here don't have Hunt Brothers Pizza, right? So let me tell you what a Hunt Brothers Pizza is. A Hunt Brothers Pizza is a pizza thing that's located in a rural gas station. And so if you live out in the country, so far out in the deep south, where there's not even a Domino's, there's nothing near you, and you want pizza, you have to go to the gas station and get a Hunt Brothers Pizza. So you know, if you see a Hunt Brothers Pizza, that you're in the middle of nowhere, okay? I mean, it's like the really bad instantiation of Wawa. Okay, so I couldn't believe Wawa when I came up and said, wow, what is this magic? So there are several things that come together in in the readings for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The logic of incarnation and the logic of redemption, and the order of knowing and the order of being. So on Christmas Eve, we kind of encounter God according to what philosophers call the order of knowing. Okay, so the shepherds encounter Jesus as he's born, and this is kind of how we meet Jesus, in the flesh, in the mud, in the kind of the earthiness of our lives. This is how we bump into him, as a thing that happens in the middle of other things that happen. But then on Christmas Day, we hear this text that tells us what this means. And this is what we call the order of being. This is the explanation of this is who God is. This is who the Word is. This is that Word that has been made flesh that we find in a stable. Luke's gospel for Christmas Eve is earthy, mundane, and transcendent all at once. It's a gospel that should be read at the end of a long journey down a country road past the Hunt Brothers Pizza. And it's a resolutely particular gospel. Luke takes great pains to locate what's going on in time. In the days when Caesar Augustus, in the days when Quirinius was governor of Syria. This isn't an archetype. This isn't a symbol. It isn't kind of a thing floating around in the realm of the symbolic. This is a thing that happened in the same way that taxes happen. In the same way that filing your taxes happen. Jesus is born into the world. But then in John's gospel completes the arc of the Christmas story. If the Luke text is about the particularity of the incarnation, the earthiness of the incarnation, about the Savior who has come, John's text is about how Jesus saves, the order of being. At first glance, these two Gospels seem to give us two very different perspectives on the coming of Christ into the world. Luke gives us the stock characters and the images for our nativity scenes, but John seems to stay way up in the realm of the abstract, anchoring the Word made flesh, not in the mud of first century Palestine, but in the sweeping history of the cosmos. But despite those differences, there's an affinity, and more than that, a necessary and even urgent correspondence between these two traditional Christmas narratives. In the first chapter of John's Gospel, the elegant and enigmatic prose immediately grabs our attention. Here is no infancy narrative. Here is no whiff of cow stall or bed of hay, let alone any sign of social unrest or political intrigue. Instead, there is order and beauty and the rhetoric that introduces the Gospel with the very same words that we read in the opening lines of Genesis, in the beginning. And as I said, this is not a coincidence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This Word is eternal. This Word is the creator of all things, and through him has come life and light. And then this, the Word became flesh and lived among us. This little phrase says everything about the divine logic that orders and reorders creation, the story that determines who we are. Word is not abstract or arbitrary. It does not relegate itself to the realm of the transcendent. This word means that the eternal decision of the triune God is to be God with us and God for us. While chapter 2 of Luke's Gospel can easily be reduced to Christmas pageant nostalgia, John's prologue can leave us bewildered by a formality that's hard to warm to. It's a common hazard of his philosophical language and of philosophers. You can friends about that. But we hear this text at Christmas for a very important reason. And that reason is that Christmas is the feast of Nicene Christology, which is just a fancy way that's saying that on Christmas we grapple with what it means to say in the Creed that Jesus Christ is very God and very man, truly divine and truly human. It's a day that calls us to hold that paradox together, to ponder it in our hearts like Mary like Jacob until it blesses us, without papering over the tensions and the sheer astonishment inherent in trying to think a thing like that. What it means to say that the Word became flesh is not to turn Jesus into some third category, not really human or not really divine. It isn't to make him out to be either a bulletproof comic book superhero or no more than a really good and inspiring man, even the best man who ever lived. It means that we hold his divinity and his humanity together until the explosive awe of Christmas is too much for us to bear. My favorite dead Swiss theologian, Karl Barth, puts it this way: in the fullness of time it became true that once and for all God became man, and so his word reached our ears. And so we were reconciled to God. This word made our time a fulfilled time, made our story a fulfilled story. And this, my brothers and sisters, is an objective fact. The wonder of Christmas is one that also points beyond itself and towards the other great feast of the church year, towards the Paschal mystery where we celebrate the revelation and the working out of that very reconciliation. Because the miracle of Christmas doesn't stand on its own. It always stands in relationship to Good Friday and Easter, to those other things that we're always trying to think at the same time. The manger points towards the cross and the empty tomb. And the good news is that because the one we adore on Christmas is precisely the one who died and was raised on the third day, and because he is also the one through whom all things were made, there is nothing beyond the reach of his saving embrace. There is nothing that is beyond God's presence, God's faithfulness, God's power. Not your fear, not your disappointment and regret, not whatever pain you carry that seems so unbearably cruel. Nothing. Because the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us right out there in the backyard where your uncle drinks too much and where we worry about what the neighbors might say. Reading these texts together from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, the full picture of salvation history comes into view. It's a story that is familial and philosophical, provincial and universal, personal and cosmic. And we find our place in that story that at once traverses the dusty roads of Nazareth just past the Hunt Brothers Pizza and reaches to the farthest galaxies of the heavens. For unto us is born in the city of David a Savior who is Christ the Lord. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. For me, this convergence calls to mind a line in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, once a stable had something in it that was bigger than the whole world. And it also comes to mind another line from another book that's ostensibly for children, but really isn't, called The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. It goes like this. When Imogene Herdman had asked me what the pageant was about, I told her it was about Jesus, but that was just part of it. Was about a new baby, and his mother and father who were in a lot of trouble, no money, no place to go, no doctor, nobody they knew. And then arriving from the east, like my uncle from New Jersey, some rich friends. But Imogene, I guess, didn't see it that way. Christmas just came over her all at once, like a case of chills and fever. And so she was crying and walking into the furniture. But lest we get lost in wonder for too long, let me step back again to those first few words of John's prologue in the beginning. And let's look in more detail about what it means that Jesus is in our beginning and that Jesus makes our time fulfilled time. Boy, this is directional, isn't it? Woo! What might a Christian account of created time and creaturely life in that time look like? Augustine's reflections on time and the Confessions grew out of an exegesis of an explanation of in the beginning God created. And that's been a consistent pattern in the tradition. Where else can we begin but in the beginning? But as Dietrich Bonhoeffer noted in his own exegesis of Genesis 1, written just as the Nazis were coming to power, Human thought pounds itself to pieces on a beginning that it both wants and cannot attain. Bonhoeffer explains that the Christian life in time is not a matter of securing our beginning, but of living from the middle, having received both our beginning and end from Christ and only from Christ. And what Bonhoeffer covered in a few pages in 1933, Karl Barth would explore more than a decade later in all its implications. In Church Dogmatics 3:2, Barth writes a section on Jesus as the Lord of time. He does this not from in the beginning, but really tellingly from Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. What does it mean to make that our story? This is Christological all the way down. This is about Jesus all the way down. And as such, it shows us what it means to confess in the Creed that through him all things were made. This is an account of time that contradicts the human logic that says our time, past, present, and future, is either about us or is about nothing. It leaves no room for faith in human progress, but at the same time, it leaves no room for despair. While it's a contradiction, it is the contradiction of grace and liberation, embrace and gift. And it has implications for our own lives and the way that we live in community with each other, how we think about the time that we're given, and how we're called to let go of our desire to grasp that time as a thing to be controlled. Here's an example of what I mean that I recently used with our students at PTS. As they were starting the semester, I remember that when I started seminary just at fall break, I had no idea what I was doing there, or why God wanted me to be there, or if I was going to pass my classes. Here I was with a PhD in mechanical engineering, and I had bombed my first midterm. My seminary career did not begin covered in glory, and I remember going to our Anglican studies professor, to the person who was the me of Duke Divinity School, and she said that more students than not go through this, even if no one wants to talk about it, that more students than not wonder if God has made a mistake with them. And too many students, and I think perhaps not only students, make the mistake of casting the glance of comparison at that point from side to side to look at how and when someone else has been called and sent into the vineyard, rather than looking to their own gifts of their own calling, their own belovedness, of trying to grasp their time in a death grip of comparison and competition. It's true for seminarians, it's true for parish clergy, it's perhaps true for bishops, but I don't want to speculate, but it's true, I think, about everyone. We can try to grasp our time as a thing to be controlled. We can try to grasp our own story as something to be turned in a certain direction, and we can turn the glance of comparison from side to side to our brothers and sisters and say, why does it look like they've got it all together and I don't? But the thing about it is that every single one of us, you and me, known and seen and called by the one who laid the foundations of the earth and who laid that glory aside for you and for me as the Word made flesh. The one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. John's prologue reminds us that our time is given to us as a gift, to live as a gift, and not as a thing to be counted or compared or recorded on a spreadsheet. Because our call comes not from our strength, but from our weakness, our brokenness, our soul sickness. I stand before you today as a sinner saved by grace. So are you. And every action and every time that comes after that is sheer gift. You know, we live in a culture where time is a commodity. We live as people who wish that we could put a claim on our time just as we wish we could put a claim on God. It's an old story in America, going back at least to the days of Benjamin Franklin, I guess one of the patron saints around here. He has this intimidating list of instructions for the well-lived life. Lost time is never found again, he said. And even today you can find articles in business journals with titles like, "I lived a day according to Benjamin Franklin's schedule and it changed my life." I mean, God, how exhausting. The hours of the day, the years of our lives are something to be fearfully grasped or managed or controlled. If only we could put them in order. If only we could put our world in order. Against that fear, against all those misguided and misbegotten attempts to put our own time and our own lives, and indeed our neighbors' lives, in order, the time of Jesus stands as a divine protest. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Karl Barth writes, "His being is that of the Lord of time, and his time is the fulfillment of all time, which is his time, extends backward and embraces all prior time as its beginning, and extends forward and embraces all subsequent time as its end, the end of all time." And now for those of you who don't speak German theology, here's what this means. On our own, time is but a flight from abyss to abyss, from the regrets of the past to the anxieties of the future. On our own, we truly have neither the past nor the future, and on our own today can become only a meaningless, ever-shifting boundary, sand always slipping through our hands. But Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Crucified, raised from the dead, and coming again in glory, his eternal time stands as a divine protest against our own. And in the body of Jesus, our human existence in time is embraced and comes to us again, not as threat, but as gift. What does that mean? It means that when we think about our past, we are no longer ruled by what might have been or what was. We are free to forget and free not to forget. We are no longer living under the pressure to make everything come out right in the end, because the end, in an absolute and concrete sense, is Jesus Christ. We are free to rejoice and love and live in the time we have. We are liberated from our fears of the future, and we can let go of the past if we need to, because in the end, in Jesus, we have all the time in the world. Time to be healed, time to be called, and time to be sent. Thanks.
A few minutes for questions?
Yeah, sure. Hello. Some questions? Yeah?
You quoted this philosopher a couple times, and I'm not sure how to spell his last name.
Oh, Kierkegaard?
No, Barth.
Barth, yeah, Barth.
And when did he live?
So he was also like Bonhoeffer. He was active in what's called the Confessing Church that was resistant to Nazi Germany, and so he died in 1968, but began writing in 1916 and was very active during World War II. No, that was Bonhoeffer. It was at Union. Yeah, Barth was, he got thrown out of Germany, and then when returned to Switzerland, he was Swiss, so he was at Basel, mostly. Yeah.
What especially appealed to you from Barth?
Yeah, so it's funny. So I took a class in seminary that was with the person who eventually became my doctoral advisor, that was on Karl Barth, and it changed my life. Barth's writing makes me more excited about Jesus Christ than anyone else. But I think that it's the way that he points so completely and resolutely to Jesus Christ as the Word made flesh, and he's always pointing to Jesus, to the incarnation and to the cross. And I think I think sometimes, as Episcopalians, and I grew up in the Episcopal Church, we can tend to, if we don't watch it, tend to start talking about God as a kind of vagueness. And I really appreciate the ways that Bart just keeps people focused on Jesus Christ. And I think it can be a really kind of a useful framework for looking at Christian faith and Christian life. Yeah. Look, back here in the gray sweater, but everybody's wearing gray sweaters, so I can't really. Yes, sir. Yes.
I was kind of hoping you would be talking more about science.
Yeah. Well, so funny enough, I don't think that message got communicated totally. But I can certainly talk about it. What do you want to talk about?
Well, in recent weeks with friends, we were talking about the subject you were talking about the morality of genetics. And you at one point you said that it's false that genetics forms our story, who we are.
Right. Yeah.
And I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But I think about it. I think that unlike Ohm's law, genetics has made me unable to play basketball. Right? And that's true. But maybe it's not true about my morality. That's not a moral thing.
Right.
So maybe you talk more about that.
Yeah, but I mean it's complicated. The reasons that I can't play basketball are not strictly a genetic thing, but has a lot to do with. I mean, they're also. Why did I not grow up playing basketball? Other than the fact that I'm 5'2", right? Other than that, I didn't grow up playing basketball. I grew up playing golf. How did that happen? So there are a lot of other factors that go into that. And so I just want to complicate it, right? And just say I think that it especially becomes dangerous when genetics are used to say something about people's incapacity. So a really famous example of this. Can you guys hear me? So a really famous example of this is, and I did some research on this once. You ever heard of the disease pellagra? Pellagra. So pellagra was a disease of niacin deficiency, of malnutrition, that happened a lot in the South, especially around the Depression. And it had some symptoms that had to do with the skin, but it also had some psychiatric symptoms. And it was really a not a good thing to have happen. Actually, my grandmother had during the Depression, and it was not good. Now, generally at that time, a lot of the leading lights of Yale and other places were certain that the
Because that means the day before Jesus was born was not incarnated and not fulfilled time.
Right. So I think what I want to do is to say that what we want to avoid is thinking of time, as I don't have a thing to draw on, so as like this, right? As a straight line, okay? So that we just kind of go up this trajectory of time towards the future. And so what is it then for humans to think, Westerners really think about time as linear kind of trajectory of progress? What happens if, when we start thinking about time liturgically and cyclically, instead of linearly? That's really just kind of what I'm getting.
17 follow-up questions, but there's a lot of people here.
Question back there?
Sure. I guess in terms of superiority or whatever, in terms of genetics, if we're all here on this earth, we've battled millennia, so we're all kind of equally superior or inferior since we've made it this far. I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we're here. And I think that's honestly, I think part of it is to say, what does it mean to think starting from what we're here, as opposed to starting from what God is. When you think from the present instead of.
And then in terms of genetic history,
Yeah.
it's all on our DNA. The person who owns this is Karen with his DNA. She's the founder of 23andMe.
Right.
Her husband is Sergey Brin, the founder of Google.
Google, yeah.
So they have all our data from us.
Great. And then, I mean, it's alarming, right? But then, I look, at the same time, I look at something like the fact that this technology we use to catch the guy, the Golden State Killer, right, the serial killer, and they took like DNA from his family, like close to the dude. And part of me is like, yeah, go police. And then part of me is like, ooh, right? That's a problem. Yes.
So I can't explain the science of it, but I understand you're doing gene surgery. I don't know what else to call it. Where you are
Splicing. Yeah.
fixing the. So where does that fall?
Yeah. So this is a question about what's called gene splicing, which is to say, I'm going to take so if you have a genetic sequence, and I'm going to take the part that's gone wrong somehow, and I'm going to kind of snip that out and plug in a part a genetic sequence that works. So that's what when we talk about gene splicing, that's what they talk about. The question there, then this is like current back and forth thing with ethicists is to say, well, is this moral both from the standpoint of, so like a Catholic perspective would say, well, the problem is that the intent to alter itself is you can't fool with it. I think sort of standard issue bioethics would look at, can we predict, if we do this, we're not sure we can predict the outcome of it, right? We don't know how this is going to end up, which is also a question. How is this technology going to be used? Is it going to be used to only to cure really, really dangerous diseases, or then is it going to turn into other stuff? Like I want a baby that is blue and black and orange tiger stripe for Princeton. Can I do that? Well, people say, no, that's of course, Kara, that's ridiculous. But the other question that bioethics asks, okay, well, if you start saying, well, we can do this for very, very dire diseases, then what's the line of dire? Right? What's the line that says, well, this is a disease bad enough, but then you say, well, do I want to use this technology for, if Yay. Well, thank you guys so much. You know,